March 19th, 1966. On March 19th, 1966, basketball coach Don Haskins started 5 black players in the NCAA National Championship. During that basketball season, Coach Don Haskins had a basketball team with 7 black players at a time when there was an average of 3 black players per team. On March 19, 1966, by winning the Division I NCAA Men's National Championship with 5 black starters, Haskins and the Texas Western Miners showed the world that it was time for a change in basketball. At the peak of the Civil Rights era, this was a shift not only in NCAA basketball, but in the Civil Rights movement. In 1954, the famous Brown v. Board of Education court case took place. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move from her seat in the front of the bus to the back of the bus. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, prohibiting discrimination in public places, making employment discrimination illegal, and providing for the integration of schools. While progress was being made, black Americans still faced adversity. Many colleges and universities would follow the country's lead and recruit players based on the color of their skin, not their skills in the court. Only the very best black players would be recruited to major schools, and most ended up sitting on the bench instead of playing. Donald Lee Haskins was born to parents Paul and Opal Haskins on March 14, 1930 in Enid, Oklahoma. Although discrimination and segregation were prevalent in the United States at that time, at the age of 12, Don Haskins developed a deep friendship with a young black man named Herman Carr. They both shared a love and a skill for basketball and practiced together every day after school. But Haskins received more opportunities than Carr because of the color of his skin. In high school, Haskins was named an all-state basketball player, and Herman Carr was not recognized despite his superior statistics. We went to get a drink of water once, and I'll never forget that sign that said, "Colored only," Haskins said, shaking his head. We couldn't even drink out of the same fountain. I don't think I ever saw color again after that. When we graduated from high school, I went to Oklahoma A&M on scholarship, and Herman went into the Army. Never understood that. Herman was a great player, but he wasn't good enough for college basketball. But he was good enough for Korea. From 1949 to 1952, Haskins played basketball at Oklahoma A&M. Haskins was a second-team all-conference selection as a senior and led the team to the NCAA semifinals in 1949 and 1951. He played for Coach Henry Iba, who was one of the greatest basketball coaches in that era and is now considered to be one of the greatest basketball coaches of all time. Henry Iba would make his players practice for 9 hours a day, every day of the week. He did not allow water breaks during practice. Henry Iba's tough coaching style greatly influenced Don Haskins. In 1961, after a successful high school coaching career, Don Haskins was interviewed and selected for the head coaching job at Texas Western College. It was agreed upon that Haskins and his family would live in the dormitory. Texas Western was a very small college in El Paso, Texas. The college cared very little about basketball, and they provided a very small budget for recruiting players out in other states. When recruiting, no top-tier players wanted to go to a small school like Texas Western. They wanted to go to places like UCLA or Kansas. But most of the good black players were overlooked by the big schools, and even if bigger schools recruited black players, most of the time they would end up sitting on the bench. Don Haskins recruited players by telling them exactly what he would do if they played for Texas Western, that he would start the best players he had, regardless of race. Don Haskins, reflecting the coaching style of Henry Iba, worked his players very hard. They routinely practiced 3 times a day, and no water breaks were allowed. As tough as his methods were, they worked. This gave Texas Western an edge in the early part of Haskins' career. The 1961-62 Texas Western Miners earned an 18-6 record. Throughout his next 3 years, the Miners appeared in 2 NCAA tournaments and had a winning percentage of .759. Before, they had only had an average winning percentage of .395. The 1965-66 Miners were what Don Haskins would later call the most talented team he had ever coached. The team had 12 players, 7 of whom were black. In a time when teams averaged 3 black players per team, this was unprecedented.
Because in those days, they had a little rule on playing people of color. You play 1 at home, you play 2 in a row, and you play 3 if you lose them.
Haskins had recruited many of his players out of large cities like New York and Detroit. 2 of his best players were the black duo of Bobby Joe Hill and David Lattin, who together averaged just under 30 points a game. They were a dominant team. As the Miners progressed through the season, they received hate mail and death threats. In one incident, one of the players was assaulted in a public bathroom. In another incident, someone broke into the motel the players were staying at and trashed their rooms and stole their things.
They didn't think very much of us as athletes. They just thought we was, put it this way, we was animals. You know, they called all kinds of foul names, monkeys, gorillas.
They finished the regular season only having 1 loss, ending with a record of 23-1. In the NCAA tournament, the Miners kicked off their first game by beating Oklahoma City 89-74. Their next game against Cincinnati almost ended their championship hopes, but Texas Western came up with a 78-76 win in overtime. In the Elite Eight, the Miners played the Kansas Jayhawks, who Don Haskins would later call the best team we played that year. The game was a thriller, ending in a double overtime 81-80 win for the Miners. Texas Western played Utah in the Final Four. The Miners won that game 85-78. Then came the big game. March 19th, 1966. The Miners would be playing against Adolph Rupp and the all-white Kentucky Wildcats. The Wildcats had finished the season 24-1 and were heavily favored to win the national championship. When the time came, Don Haskins courageously decided to start 5 black players instead of following the unwritten Jim Crow era rules. Those 5 players were Bobby Joe Hill, Orson Artis, Willie Worsley, Harry Flournoy, and David Lattin. Although Haskins and the team had received hate mail and verbal harassment all season long, that night was especially horrible. The fans verbally assaulted and threw things at the players as they walked through the tunnel, and some even waved Confederate flags in the stands. But after it was all said and done, Texas Western beat Kentucky 72-65. The Texas Western Miners shocked the nation. That night, March 19th, 1966, Don Haskins proved to the American people that it was time for a change in basketball. In the short term, Haskins, as the Miners basketball coach, showed the world that basketball wasn't about the color of your skin, but your skills on the court.
After the championship game, we become basketball players. Before, we were just a bunch of athletes that could run and jump. We wasn't smart enough to win important games. We wasn't developed enough to handle the pressure, the TV pressure and the meeting pressure. So that put us, meaning people of color, on the map that we couldn't handle pressure. Now, I do believe And winning that game speed the integration up quickly. Not only for the players, but for the coaches to make those buku money in all white colleges.
In the years following the national championship, more and more teams began to realize that if they wanted to win, they would have to put racism aside, as Haskins did, and put the best players on the court. In 2 years following the championship, the all-white ACC conference was fully integrated. In 1970, Adolph Rupp, the legendary coach of Kentucky and a well-known racist, recruited the first black player in Kentucky history. More and more teams began recruiting black players. In the long term, the 1966 NCAA championship basketball game was a way to promote integration by putting black players in front of people at their homes on their televisions. Sports unify people of all different cultures. The influence of this game was not limited to just coaches and players, but to all of the people watching. In a well-beloved sport, such as basketball, the integration that occurred over multiple years was normalized, providing momentum to the civil rights movement and symbolizing a change for all society, not just sports. While his players would say that Haskins was not trying to be a hero by starting 5 black players, he knew the impact of the decisions he was making.